Okay, so we're going to begin session 10, Democracy, Activism and Violent Extremism, which is a panel session of speakers who are who proposed the panel together. So in keeping with our the significance of staying on time, I'm going to try and arrange that for this session as well. So the bio notes are, of course, printed in the program for you. So our first speaker here is Charlie Pittaway. Charlie's title is Social and Temporal Predictors of Pro and Anti-Democratic Attitudes and Support for Political Violence. Thanks, Charlie.
Hi, everyone. As you heard, my name's Charlie, and I am a second-year PhD candidate at the University of Queensland. My research focuses on people's perceptions of the future and climate action, actually, but we have reason to believe that the ways that people think about the present and the future are also implicated in a range of social and political outcomes, which forms the basis of my talk today on support for democracy and political violence. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge that we're on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people and pay my respects to their elders past and present. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I also want to just briefly introduce my co-authors on this paper, some of whom you'll hear from today. Dr. Susilo Wibisono from the University of Queensland, Dr. Joanna Saltis from the University of Adelaide, and Professor Winnifred Lewis, whose research lab, the Social Change Lab, is involved in a range of research looking at the social psychology of peace, democracy, and human rights. So I'm sure it goes without saying at this point that global democracy is facing a bit of a problem. Since about the mid-2000s, we've seen at least 10 democracies fail, and authoritarian populist parties are either in power or gaining power in many countries. In order to address issues like these, more interdisciplinary research needs to be done. Fields like psychology, sociology, and political science are often trying to tackle the same issues while still somehow remaining almost entirely separate from one another. So our lab is trying to take an interdisciplinary approach to the study of support for democratic attitudes. We hope to test a range of predictors that have been identified as important in the study of democracy, as well as introduce some novel psychological variables that haven't been approached in this field before. The slides aren't showing. Oh, apologies.
So that was their fault.
Yeah. Okay. So the social and cultural factors which may contribute to the undermining of democracy are numerous and interrelated. Things like increasing distrust and division between opposing political views, increased support for anti-democratic attitudes, and are thought to undermine the institutions of democracy, alongside an escalating culture of conspiratorial thinking. Social and economic inequality are also thought to increase support for authoritarian strongman leaders who advocate for strict obedience to authority and are willing to limit individual freedoms. In addition, we must not ignore the importance of attitudes of the public towards democracy. Support for democracy is crucial to the stability of democracy. Without it, democratic institutions are likely to be seen as illegitimate and to crumble. And as we sort of would expect, as support for strongman leaders increases, support for democracy decreases. Anti-democratic attitudes, like support for authoritarian rule, are also thought to go hand in hand with support for political violence. Now, Australia is generally considered to have a pretty strong democracy, with a global democracy index of about 8.7 out of 10 and a ranking of about 15 out of 160 or so different countries. However, Australia's democracy score has been dropping steadily for the past few years. Additionally, Australian satisfaction with democracy and trust in government reached record lows in 2019. Given that low trust in government is also thought to erode support for democracy, this could be cause for concern. From across the spectrum of sociological, political, and psychological research into support for democracy, it appears that certain groups tend to be less supportive than others. For example, young people are thought of as particularly disengaged with democracy, and globally, youth satisfaction with democracy is declining. In Australia in 2023, 1 in 4 Australians between the ages of 18 and 29 reported thinking that in some circumstances, a non-democratic government could be preferable. However, the relationship of age to support for democracy is still pretty unclear. Some research finds that young people are less likely to vote, whereas other research finds that they're more likely to be engaged in alternative forms of participative democracy and to be supportive of reforms that would make voting easier. Other social characteristics that have been identified as important are things like male gender, lower education, and conservative political views, just to name a few. So in the present research, we wanted to test all of these variables as well as additional social characteristics in a large community sample in Australia. And we also wanted to introduce a novel psychological variable to this space, temporal orientation. There's evidence that the way that people think about the present and the future relates to their social and political attitudes, but this is pretty firmly situated in the psychological sphere and hasn't really expanded out to these other areas interested in democracy attitudes. So I'll just sort of briefly summarize it for you. Present-oriented individuals tend to place high value on immediate gratification, and as a result, tend to devalue the future more often and to a higher degree. These temporally short-sighted individuals tend to be more politically conservative and also show higher rates of impulsivity and interpersonal aggression. Comparatively, future-oriented individuals tend to place high value on the potential future outcomes of their behavior and are more willing to sacrifice present desires in the interest of achieving distant future outcomes. These temporally far-sighted individuals tend to have higher rates of political participation, like voting. Now, future and present orientation have not really been explored in relation to democratic attitudes before, but considering the long-term consequences of the erosion of democracy on things like human rights, we hypothesized that future orientation would be associated with support for democracy, whereas present orientation would be associated with attitudes that might undermine democracy. So in the present study, we recruited 966 adult Queenslanders through a pool participants platform, and we had 3 aims that I will take you through now. First of all, we wanted to identify the social and temporal predictors of democratic attitudes using hierarchical regression. We measured 2 pro-democracy attitudes, and they were the importance of democracy and belief that free elections are essential to democracy. These were both measured on a 1 to 10 scale, and our means were, for the sample, were above 8. So you can see that in our community sample, pro-democracy attitudes were quite high. We also measured 2 anti-democracy attitudes, which reflected support for authoritarian rule. We had support for a strong leader who doesn't need to bother with parliament or elections, and belief that an essential characteristic of democracy is that armies should take over when governments are incompetent. Support for a strongman leader was measured on a 1 to 4 scale, and the mean was just below 2. And belief that armies should take over when governments are incompetent was again on a 1 to 10 scale, and the mean was just below 4. So you can see that while the means for pro-democracy attitudes in our sample were very high, support for anti-democracy attitudes were also sort of higher than we might want. Our second aim was to determine whether the predictors of support for authoritarian rule were also predictive of support for political violence, given that these ideas are thought to go hand in hand. And we asked participants their thoughts on terrorism, political violence by protesters, and political violence by police against protesters. All of these were again on a 1 to 10 scale, and means were pretty low across the board, with the highest means for support for violence by police against protesters. I'll just go through the pattern of results to avoid overwhelming you all with numbers. So to begin with, we found a consistent relationship of age to democracy attitudes. We found that older age was related to more support for democracy, and younger age was related to more support for authoritarian rule and political violence. Consistent with past work, we found that progressive political attitudes were supportive of pro-democracy attitudes, whereas conservative political views were associated with these anti-democratic views. And we found an inconsistent relationship of gender. Unexpectedly, we found that women were more supportive of military coups, which was not in the direction that we would expect from past work. But we did find that men were more supportive of protester violence and police violence, which is in line with past findings. We also found that higher perceptions of subjective wealth were associated with more support for police violence, but this relationship didn't generalize to other anti-democratic attitudes. As you can see from all of these blank cells on the screen, the other social characteristics in our model were not significant when controlling for all of the relationships. And then regarding our novel psychological factors, our hypotheses were supported. So we found that future orientation was associated with more support for democracy, whereas present orientation was associated with more support for authoritarian rule and political violence across the board, above and beyond the influence of social characteristics alone. So as interesting as these findings were to us, we also recognized that because we were using hierarchical regression, which is an item-centered analytical approach, this really only tells us about the average linear relationships that hold for the typical person, whereas atypical people are invisible to these approaches. And we would argue that people who are really anti-democracy and really pro-violence are probably, hopefully, pretty atypical. So our third aim was to supplement these findings with person-centered analyses using latent profile analysis, which I'll just very briefly summarize. So latent profile analysis is an approach that identifies subgroups within the data of participants who are similar to one another based on their pattern of responses to a series of indicator variables. In our case, the indicator variables were the same social and temporal predictors that we used in our regression. LPA allows for within group variability, accounts for measurement error, and is less subjective than typical person-centered approaches because it inferentially tests the number of profiles that best represent the underlying structure of the data. In our sample, we found that 5 profiles was the optimal number, meaning this was the most we could find that were still able to be easily distinguishable from one another. And then when we characterized these on the indicator variables, we found that we had 2 profiles that were substantially younger than the sample mean, one which was present-oriented, one which was future-oriented. We had 2 profiles that were substantially older than the sample mean, again, one present-oriented and one future-oriented. And then we had 1 profile which was at about the average on age, making them approximately middle-aged, and they were more present-oriented than future-oriented. And you can see that the younger present-oriented profile was the largest profile in our sample at about 30% of the sample. So the next step in LPA is to look at how all of our profiles differ on our outcome variables. And what these figures on the slide show is that really it was only the younger profile that was also present-oriented that was considerably below the sample mean on pro-democracy attitudes and above the sample mean on anti-democracy attitudes and support for political violence. Comparatively, our other young profile that was future-oriented and our older profiles that were present-oriented did not show these same relationships. So just to sort of summarize and tie together all of our findings, we found in multiple regressions testing the unique associations of each predictor when controlling for the others, that younger age was associated with low support for democracy and high support for authoritarian rule and political violence. Consistent with past work, we found that conservative political views were also associated with these attitudes that undermine democracy. We found no consistent effects for gender or wealth, and all of our other social characteristics were non-significant. And then controlling for all of the above, we found that future orientation was associated with support for democracy, and present orientation was associated with support for authoritarian rule and political violence. I mentioned earlier that present-oriented individuals tend to show higher rates of interpersonal aggression, and that is likely because they fail to consider the potential future consequences of such behavior. And so our results might reflect similar processes. However, our person-centered results add considerable nuance to this story. The average linear trends indicate that in our sample, young people are really anti-democracy and pro-violence, but this is misleading because this is really only true of young people who are also present-oriented. At the beginning of this talk, I noted that the relationship of age to democratic attitudes is kind of conflicted, and our results do seem to indicate this. I hope that our findings provide some value for the importance of combining item and person-centered analyses, especially when we're looking at these really complicated social and political attitudes, because without bringing the whole picture into focus, we can't possibly think to intervene and sort of unbind the increasing anti-democratic sentiment. And in terms of where to from here, we hope for more interdisciplinary research, more studies that combine item and person-centered analyses, and the value of our finding that future orientation is associated with pro-democracy attitudes is that this is a psychological variable that we can probably move people on. So yesterday in J.M. Berger's talk, I think I remember seeing something about dominant extremist groups being characterized by presentism, which sort of indicates that different groups might have different ways of engaging with the present and the future and the narratives that they use, which are then probably passed on to the group members. And there is also evidence that we can sort of develop future thinking and connect people to the future. And this opens up all these opportunities for interventions to sort of increase support for democracy, or at least to combat anti-democratic attitudes. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Charlie, and for keeping perfectly to time. Okay, so our next speaker is Dr. Susilo Wibisono, apologies, with the paper titled A Network Analysis of Conventional and Radical Behaviours Within Groups. So I'll wave at you with a 5-minute warning and a 2-minute warning.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Good day, everyone. My name is Susilo Wibisono. I'm a postdoc at School of Psychology, University of Queensland. And today I'm going to present my research, with my colleague, also with Professor Winnifred Lewis. So it's about network analysis. So we apply this network analysis to examine the interconnections between different issues that the participants or the people support, and also different tactics that people apply to support the most important issues that they engage with. So firstly, I'm going to briefly introduce the social network analysis. It's widely used in many different areas, including in psychology. It's normally used to examine the interconnection or interrelations between different parties that engage in the same issues, and look at those interconnections more specifically. In psychological research, the similar technique is also applied not only to look at the interconnection between different parties, but also the interconnection between different issues or different themes, or more generally, we might call it as different variables. Like in the field of psychology, the network analysis is not only applied in social psychology, but also in personality psychology and more clinical psychology. So what we do in this research, so firstly, we apply the network analysis to examine the interconnection of people involvement with different issues that they support. And also, we also examine the interconnection of different actions, or more specifically, different tactics that they use as collective action, which is the action that people take on behalf of the group or for the interest of the group, not for themselves individually, to support the most important cause or the most important issues that they engage with. And then we also propose the approach to look at more specifically on the networks from these two topics, the issues and the tactics. And then based on the network analysis, we extract some values or some measures from the network analysis, like the group size or the group centrality, and we use those measures with some different variables that we also measure to predict the engagement with two types of action, we call it. So the conventional action and more radical actions. So at least there are three terms that I minded to clarify in networks analysis. So the nodes represent the variables. I mean, visually it's represented by it can be circles, triangles, or squares that represents the issues and the types of action in our research. And then the edge represents the interconnection. So it can be thin, it can be thick, different strength between, different strength of the connection between the issues or the actions. And the different color, in our research, we represent the third variable that we include in the network analysis, which is political orientation. So we also measure political orientation to look at how different political orientation might influence different engagement in different issues and different engagement in different tactics of collective action. This is the method, the method that we apply to collect the data. So we invite the participants, almost 1,000 Queenslanders, into our survey, and then we ask them to identify whether they support these issues through their collective action in the last year. So we identify 17 issues, from climate change issues, animal rights, and then some issues related to the COVID policies, because we conducted this survey in 2022. And then you also ask the participants to identify which types of collective action that they engage in the last years to support the most important issues that they support. And then we also measure political orientation by self-declaration. So it's like a single question to ask the participants to identify the level of their political orientation, whether they tend to be left or tend to be right. And then we also measure social enemy, this perceived breakdown of social values and norms in their life, and also their evaluation about the past collective action that they engage with, whether they perceive it as successful action or failed action. Okay, so the first analysis that we conducted, so we do the network analysis for the issues, and this is the overall network that we got from those participants. So different issues have different level of support indicated by different size of the nodes, and also they have different level of connections between the issues. And then more specifically, we can also see that political orientation might be associated with particular issues. I mean, left political orientation is more associated with particular issues, and right political orientation is also associated with different issues, although we might also find some issues that are supported by both people from left and people from right political orientation. And then the next analysis that we propose in network analysis, we want to look at more specifically which issues that are more central than the others by considering the strength of the edge or the strength of the connection between issues. So I can talk more about the approach that we propose. The main thing here, we apply some different threshold to reduce or to remove the issues, and then more specifically, we might find the issues that are more central than the others and look at their connection. So these are the list of the threshold that we apply based on the level of each visibility that represents the strength of the connection between different issues. And then at the first round, we might remove anti-LGBT and anti-immigration from the network because they are not central, or simply they are not really connected to the other issues. The people who support this anti-LGBT and anti-immigration, they tend to support only this issue and they are not support the other issues. So, and then we apply 6 rounds of analysis to look at more, to find the more central issues, and we found this pattern. So it indicates that we call it as the volatility of collective action, that collective action is characterized by swift and unexpected change in terms of the target, in terms of the forms, and even the tactics. So as you can see here, that there are some strong connections between different issues that the people support. And then what if this method is applied in terms of the tactics? So this is the overall network analysis of 21 tactics that we examined in the survey and how they are linked to political orientation. So as we can see here, that the blue color more represent, more radical tactics like hunger strike, disrupting an event is more supported by right political people, while more conventional tactic is more supported by left political people. And then we apply the same approach to reduce the tactics that are not connected to the others. And we found here that more conventional tactics are strongly connected with the other tactics from the same categories. The conventional tactics as well. And the radical tactics are less connected to the others. So the key points that we got from this process is, so the interconnection is not only related to it's not only about the different issues, but also the different tactics. That's the first point. And then we believe that political orientation also matters to support different groups and different tactics. And we may also recommend some further analysis related to the strength of the connections in terms of the issues and in terms of the tactics that work for further examination, because those issues and those tactics are more central than the others. And then we extract the values from the network analysis and try to use multi-level analysis to predict, to answer the questions about what might predict people engagement in conventional and radical action. And then we create 2 different levels. The first one is the individual level that we calculated based on the summary of individual engagement in conventional and radical action. And then at the group level that we average from the people support through that the people support for that issue by using both conventional and radical tactic. And then from the network analysis, we also extract the group size. So it's just the number of people support for different issues and also the group centrality, more specifically the betweener centrality that represents how the issues is strongly connected to the other issues. And then also some variables that we directly measure, the perceived enemy and the perceived success and failure in the past collective action that they engage with. So this is the simple result of the multi-level analysis that we conducted. So as we can see here, that group size is negatively predict the group level of conventional action, but non-significantly predict the individual level of the same type of action. And then the group size positively predict engagement in radical action at group level, but negatively predict individual engagement in radical action. And then perceived anomie, for example, positively predict engagement in conventional action at group level, but negatively predict engagement in radical action in the same level. So what we know so far from the overall research, so firstly, network analysis can help us to understand what we call as the volatility of collective action, how different causes or different types of action are connected or even change. And it might reveal the significance and the relationship between those issues and those tactics. And then we also think that the method that we propose to more focusedly looking at the more central issues or more central tactics will be helpful to retain the important information from the networks, especially when we talk about the larger issues that involve like a bigger number of the groups. And then from multi-level analysis, we acknowledge that it's quite difficult to get the conclusion because the results tend to be inconsistent between different types of action and different level of analysis in individual and in group level. I think that's all that we have from our research. And then lastly, I want to acknowledge the contribution of wonderful people in our team. Firstly, Professor Winnifred Lewis, and also some colleagues, Mengyao and Kathleen Light, as well as Charlie Pittaway. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Our next speaker is Dr. Robyn Banks with the paper Criminalization of Climate Change Protest. Thanks, Robyn.
Thank you, and what an amazing conference. Well done all. So I'm here to present on a paper jointly authored on the criminalisation of climate change protests. And I want to begin by acknowledging my colleagues on that paper, Professor Kelly Fielding, Professor Winnifred Lewis, and the lead author, Dr. Robyn Gulliver. I'm the odd one out in this group because I'm a lawyer. The others are much more embedded in the field of social psychology, but I have developing expertise in the psychology of law and prejudice. In terms of what I'm going to cover in this paper, I'm going to look at the strategies used by state and non-state actors to suppress dissent, focused on climate activism. And the period for all of this research is 2010 to 2020, so all of the methods we applied to that period. I'll give an overview of legislation enacted in Australia during that period that in one way or another can be used to affect protest rights, and also data on the prevalence of climate change protests in the same period. While my two colleagues and Winnifred will be focused more on the psychological. This study includes a legal scholarship aimed at documenting and understanding the criminalisation of protests and its impact here in Australia in particular. In terms of the methodology underpinning the paper, we undertook two sweeps, one of Facebook pages to identify events on Facebook around disruptive climate-related protests, and we identified almost 28,000 of those for the period, and a sweep of Australian media looking for reports of climate-related arrests. And we found close to 2,500 articles, which was reduced through analysis to 81. We also compiled a list of all legislative action, state, territory and federal, that had the potential to affect protest. And the full list of media articles and the arrest data is all available on Open Science Framework and referenced in the paper. When we talk about criminalisation in this paper, we're not limiting it to actions by government to create and police protest actions as crimes. We take that idea more broadly to include formal and legislative criminalisation, which is that more traditional understanding, to informal and expansionary criminalisation and rhetorical criminalisation. These mechanisms interact, and the latter two arguably increase the acceptance by the general population of the first, the criminalisation of protest actions. So turning now to why protest actions might be criminalised. So in the paper, we identify at least 3 political aims of criminalisation, the first of which is that political actors may be seeking to increase their popularity through a law and order type approach in terms of both their raw vote, but also in terms of any leadership aspirations they may have. They use that law and order posturing to be seen as leaders, and in doing so to other protesters in the public mind. Some may be responding to what they genuinely consider as subversive to the state and undermining of democratic processes. And finally, they may be focusing on an aim relating specifically to the activists themselves. They may be seeking to increase the costs to those protesters of engaging in activism, in some cases to benefit commercial activities and for other reasons. So turning first to the legislative criminalisation, our data analysis indicated that there were 14 amendments or bills tabled to amend the law that could impact on climate protest. Not all of those were passed, and some of them have subsequently been repealed for various reasons. Most of the legislation, whether it was enacted or not, created or sought to create new offences linked to common protest tactics. And you'll see that there are some jurisdictions where there was no activity in the legislative space, but New South Wales is the high point. Thank you, New South Wales. Interestingly, just as by way of example, in New South Wales, we saw an expansion of the range of charges and of the powers that police have available to them to police protesters, disperse them, etc. Increased powers to declare public reserves with move-on, exclusion and seizure powers attached, powers in relation to gatherings, meetings and assemblies on Crown land, prohibitions of entry onto some farmlands and specific land around Sydney Harbour. So that's just one of the jurisdictions. This flurry of legislative activity has been described by the Human Rights Law Centre as creating vague and ill-defined offences, excessive police powers, disproportionately harsh penalties, and the prioritisation of commercial interests, particularly forestry and mining, over the rights of individuals. It's also been described by others as disproportionately criminalising climate-related protest. There have been examples of the laws being applied in practice, and people will know of Deanna or Violet Coco, who was arrested for stopping traffic on the Sydney Harbour Bridge for 25 minutes. She was charged, convicted and imprisoned. She's not the only protester to have faced such charges or to be convicted and imprisoned for them. And there has been media coverage of these incidents, but the use of things like on-the-spot fines and even minor criminal charges are likely to be occurring much more commonly than we see in the media, and that our survey identified, because those other actions don't necessarily involve court action, or their action at the lowest court levels. So we don't necessarily see them in the media scan. But turning to the second form, expansionary criminalisation. So this is the criminalisation of routine and standard peaceful citizen actions. And it can be done through a range of mechanisms. For example, the increased use by police of their highly discretionary and expanded move-on powers to apply particularly to protest. And it can include the use of existing powers that were established for antisocial behaviour and crime more broadly, applying those specifically to protest actions. The increased use of on-the-spot fines for actions including possession of items as innocuous as placards and banners, and weirdly, and there's a reason for it, but possessing insects under the G20 laws in Queensland. Police have used their powers to determine the areas where protest is permitted, to narrow those areas. They've used warrantless search powers and creation of prohibited persons lists. We also see the laying of excessive charges, which means that a person is much more likely to be denied bail, so they end up in detention, which is a very onerous outcome before a finding of guilt. And those charges are subsequently dropped, reducing it to a much more minor set of offences. And the use of bail conditions to restrict protesters from going into particular areas. Associated with this, and I'm going to really skim over this, is the use of sort of private expansionary criminalisation, so what us lawyers would refer to as slap suits, strategic litigation against public protest. Legal actions launched or threatened by corporations against protesters, and we've seen quite a lot of that as recently as in the last week. It's been in the media. And also actions that undermine the financial viability of community organisations, like challenges to their charitable status and the defunding of core groups within this movement, like the Climate Council. Again, these are hard strategies to track. Some of them we see because they hit the headlines, but many of them are hard to track and document, and it's likely they're more prevalent and diverse than we have been able to identify. Turning to the third form of criminalisation, rhetorical criminalisation, it's the stigmatising, the use of language and the power of language to stigmatise those who are engaged in protest, both in terms of their activities, but also them themselves. So it's the use of language to suggest that they're criminal, that they're outside the norms of acceptable behaviour and good citizenship, and that they're a drain on society. We've seen the use of very pejorative and stereotyping labels like idiots, lazy bastards, extremists, and the really weird one, bully babies. Strange. These serve to delegitimise protesters and protest actions, while taking the focus quite effectively away from the literally burning issues that the protesters are seeking to bring to the public attention. They create an environment in which criminalisation of the exercise of rights and freedoms related to protest becomes accepted, more accepted in the general community. So over this same period where we've seen a growth of those forms of criminalisation, we've also seen disruptive climate protests increasing in Australia. And for example, there've been 1,800 rallies in that period. And we thought we were able to identify 964 climate-related arrests during the period. Now, that won't be anything like the full scope of arrests because arrest records aren't generally available. These are the ones we were able to identify from the media scan. We've also, over the same period, seen a growth in the number of environmental groups, with 206 new groups established in the period. It all raises an obvious question of why people turn to protest. And there's plenty of research on this. And an important set of ideas is that it represents a sense that there are deficiencies in our democratic institutions and our decision-making processes, and that people have lost or don't have a meaningful way of engaging with important decision-making that affects their lives, like climate action. In Australia, we have a very long tradition of protest rights, including workers' rights from the 1800s, the ongoing protests for recognition of Aboriginal rights, and obviously in this context, the role of environmental protest in Australia. All that happens in Australia in the absence of any comprehensive human rights framework, the only Western democracy without that, and that enables the erosion of those really core rights, freedom of speech, freedom of association, and freedom of assembly, without any backstop in the form of a human rights framework. And in Australia at the moment, it's easy to explain why there's protests. There's very high public support for climate action and a lack of action by our governments to do something about the disaster of climate change. So in conclusion, it's really interesting that despite all that criminalisation activity, that flurry of all sorts of different types of ways to criminalise, we actually have seen increased protests. and growth in climate action groups. We've seen the development of identity-based groups, including farmers for climate action and social workers for climate actions. And these identity-based groups are really interesting because they may in fact be a conscious strategy to stymie efforts to other or stereotype protesters. Hard to stereotype a farmer as some rabid protester. They're not known for that being their activities. We also see a differentiation with the more established groups pulling back perhaps from the more radical actions and leaving that space for the newer and emerging groups. And we're seeing new protest strategies. So I mentioned insects, that's the use of bees to distress horses being used to police riots. Who knew? And so new tactics. As things are criminalised, you come up with a new way to protest effectively. And we see increasing use by those who won't go out and protest on the streets or engage in the disruptive action, new involvement of them through fundraising, through being able to give money to support the protesters and thereby spread the burden of the legislative criminalisation and expansionary criminalisation. All this sort of lack of effectiveness, so we argue that criminalisation hasn't been effective in this case, and that it's perhaps unsurprising given the reasons people protest and the sense that governments are not listening or responding with the necessary urgency to the growing climate crisis. Thank you.
Okay, our final speaker, Professor Winnifred, with the paper Democratic Activism, Repression and Violent Extremism, Empirical Interrelationships in Australia. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm meant to draw those talks together, and you may be wondering how I'm going to do it. Firstly, with boundless enthusiasm for my colleagues. Well done, you guys. The story so far, to recap, Charlie Pittaway and team highlighted that some of the same people, present-oriented young people, support authoritarianism and political violence and democracy, and have lower support for democracy. Susilo, Wibisono and team highlighted how the causes are interrelated and that are contested across Australia and across time. And Robyn, Gulliver and team highlighted that radical actions by some protesters evoke some state actors' moves to criminalize dissent, and that criminalization hasn't demonstrably reduced direct action and may increase it. In fact, there is a psychological process that links these three empirical lines of work to each other. And that is a line of work that I'm very interested in, that I'm pursuing in my lab with many, many colleagues and in different areas of Australian democratic contestation. The psychological process is mutual radicalization. That's the label in intergroup social psychology. And the primary theoretician is Moghadam. Some of you may know Pratt's work in sociology, where he uses the term co-radicalization. And in both of those scholars' work, the primary focus was on how extremists from one side of politics can afford, empower, and amplify another. So the dominant thrust of that work has been looking at how Islamist extremists and right-wing extremists, far from being, although they're politically oppositional, far from undermining each other, they actually empower each other. The growth of Islamic extremism was associated with the growth of right-wing extremism, and of course the feedback loop from increased right-wing atrocities to disadvantaged groups mobilizing is understandable. But there's another perhaps less well-known line of work, and I think it's an older line of work. I trace it to Krellinston, 2002. There's probably many others who look at the relationship between protesters and the state, and a process of mutual radicalization that with my former student, Robyn Gulliver, we've been very interested in understanding that radical protesters afford, empower, and amplify repressive state actors and vice versa. You know, we've spent much of the last day and a half putting up on the screen examples of extremists, their rhetoric, their understanding. And I won't go so far as to assume that we're all repressive state actors, that I hope you can understand that the attention is drawn from the authorities. If there are protesters who use law breaking, and particularly if they use violence, that inevitably must draw the attention of the military and the intelligence communities, as well as the police and security communities broadly. And they have to orient to that threat and they have to respond to it. But so too, as a great deal of work looking at the narratives, but also empirical data in Australia and elsewhere shows, the failure of legitimate forms of protest can become something that leads protesters to develop narratives that suggest that there's a lack of responsive authorities, as highlighted in the Burgess talk, that the state is not responsive to conventional protests, that in fact, if you continue to do petitions and rallies, you will end up going nowhere, and something more is called for. Direct action, law breaking, violence, something more is needed to break the hold of these corrupt authorities on the state. Restart now. No, I do not want that. So I'm interested in this dynamic and understanding how we could interrupt these cycles. The first thing is to understand, I think, some common psychologies. And so reframe and look at those stories so far through this lens. Charlie Pittaway's important work, highlighting in this presentation, but also in other areas of their PhD, suggests that some of the same psychology underpins authoritarian state repression, support for police violence against protesters, and support for protester violence against police. And that is present-mindedness, temporal orientation. Now, if you're like me 2 years ago, this has not crossed your mind as an important thing. I suspect that's because in many professional communities, we're actually very siloed based on our temporal orientation. The whole field of academia supports future orientation. We have very long-term time horizons in our field. And in other disciplines, it may be the same. But actually, I now believe temporal orientation is a critical and neglected part of the story of individuals and groups radicalizing. Susilo and team have highlighted that what you learn in one protest, you carry to the next. And we see that in the presentations today, the shift from anti-vax to anti-voice. Regardless of the ideological difference, the tactical learnings can be drawn. And what Robyn's presentation shows is that the state's learnings as well, the criminalization of protest with the G20 used to repress environmental protests in New South Wales or elsewhere, these are interesting dynamics in light of the potential for a reinforcing feedback loop between law-breaking protest and repressive measures. And that's a feedback loop that perhaps many people are oblivious to, both among the law-breaking protesters and certainly among the many of the politicians and security communities that are implementing some repressive measures. And I think that this line of work is important because it illustrates the interconnections that many of us have started to grapple with in the presentations that we've seen throughout this incredibly interesting conference. The system of extremism and democracy that simultaneously shifts towards more high functioning or towards more polarization and low functioning across a range of causes and across a range of groups. And so we can look at three levels, I think, in my work, the individual, the group process, and the intergroup. But we can imagine that these relationships and processes are in systems that we might seek to intervene in. So as Charlie highlighted, we can ask, can future orientation be learned? What are the experiences that lead people to become more present-oriented versus future? Somewhat troublingly, already there's work in Germany to suggest that the COVID epidemic made the whole society, but especially young people, shift towards present-mindedness. There's other work we know well within psychology. There's an enormous body of work showing that threat makes you more present-minded. So in light of the dynamics of a world pandemic plus threat, I think this is something of great interest to us, but we can understand potentially the possibility to unpack and reverse that. We also can ask, as Susilo has done, and as we'll look in longitudinal research, about using the centrality of a cause to imagine an influence pathway into the fringe. So of course, we understand these trajectories of possible radicalization where fringe groups intentionally seek to move into the center and to colonize it. But have we taken advantage of the relationship that exists intentionally to try and look at the tactical learnings moving in the other directions, in particular looking at the exit of groups, activist groups, as well as broad movements from that violent and direct action space. I have a number of other grants, which I'm just going to put up there and describe in 30 seconds so that we have more time for discussion. I actually have a grant on collective gridlock in the climate space and looking at reconciliation in Australia. We didn't plan for the referendum, but it has been very interesting to try and understand where groups have been in contestation for a long period of time, for decades, and there's a perception of failure. I have a line of work looking at the importance of unconventional advocates. Some of those are those identity groups that Robyn mentioned in terms of building coalitions that can help to shift a society towards violence or away from it. I have an extremely fun agent-based modeling project, which I only barely understand, but I'm prepared to drop, name drop in this. And I think it makes me sound smarter, don't you think? And I'm writing a book on how systems resist change that'll try to draw together a new psychology of intergroup relations. I'm super interested in hearing from other people that are trying to use system modeling and empirical work, as well as particularly in interventions. I think that for the scholarship, understanding the effective psychology of law is actually really important. I remember when Robyn and I met at a constitutional law conference in 2016, I think. It never would have occurred to me that psychology had anything to say to the law, or that law had anything to say to psychology. Now I can't understand that blind spot. They're actually completely overlapping. The social psychology of groups in conflict is the psychology of law. So we need to understand what's going on. And in particular, we need to problematize the erosion of trust in the judiciary and in the laws, and perhaps the decline in functioning of the laws, particularly around public contests in Australia, and see that as a massive area for intervention. I want to stop there, but that's only so that we can have further conversations. I've put my email address up. Most of this work is still very much ongoing, but if you'd like to be added to our mailing list to receive copies of our papers, we can do that. And of course, some of the work is already published, and we'd be happy to spam you with our articles. So happy. Please reach out. That's all. Thank you.